Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall, who is the line editor for Lords of the Middle Sea, RuneQuest, and all things BRP at Chaosium, and we spoke about what stories don't work in tabletop role-playing games. Jason feels very passionately that this kind of isn't true. Any story can work, but I did my best to dive into the question a little bit more deeply and get some interesting answers from him about how exactly TTRPGs work to tell stories. I'll jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, please subscribe to our channel here, and thanks for watching.
Well, I would say honestly, that question I would have answered very differently 10 years ago, but right now I think that there's you can explore almost any sort of story in an RPG. The mechanics for personality traits and passions, that come all the way back to Pendragon and Call of Cthulhu, have given people mechanistic ways of modeling all kinds of behavior and inner drives. I think a while ago I would have thought, oh, it's, RPGs are not a place to tell stories of office romances or people's inner struggles. But then you get games like Thousand Year Vampire, which is just a journaling game, or you get games like Pasión de la Passions, I think, which is a telenovela game, which is entirely based on trying to emulate the world of Mexican soap operas. And so, there are games where you are like Blue Sky Stories, where you're basically, there's no conflict. You're just roaming a large environment, doing crafts and, exploring and interacting with people. And so I think that what I would have probably old me might have said, I think that, games that don't have some sort of central conflict are not possible or not ideal for RPGs. Now I've become older and softer in my views, and the explosion of like indie RPGs that really explore these topics. And I think that a large part of that comes from in some ways just the broadening of the creative base for RPGs. A lot more women, a lot more like non-white people are coming into the thing, and RPG design and creation is no longer primarily the franchise of what used to be a very middle class white usually male audience. And so now you've got this tremendously diverse group of people coming in and trying to tell stories that aren't the things that are that you would imagine. And so I think that now I would say there are almost no stories that can't be told on a tabletop RPG. I might, if we wanted to get a little crazy, we might say, well, what is an RPG? And we would be here all night, like literally trying to define what that is. And it's morning here, so I'm saying this would be a very long topic. But also just, I think maybe the real question would be what topics are good for what sets of rules, like trying to figure that out. I mean, if you're doing a Sherlock Holmes game, you probably don't want to model it after a first-person shooter, these sorts of things. But maybe you could.
I think that's a really good answer. And I think you're pretty much right. There really are a bunch of ways you can approach TTRPGs. That's what's so great about them. But in a practical sense, you can also discuss the format from like a storytelling perspective. And I'm interested in about maybe ways that some elements of TTRPGs make certain stories more difficult. And I think in the same way that you might be able to talk about some films are hard to tell, or hard to create. So let me ask you this. Most TTRPGs, by and large, rely on a group format. You've talked about Thousand Year Old Vampire, which is a journaling game, but largely it's a social activity. Are there stories that are inherently more difficult to tell when you're in a social storytelling group?
That is another very good question, one that I think the mold has been broken on. And that goes even back to, what was that game, Wraith? And then another game that virtually no one has heard of called Chaotic, which yes, that's a really rare deep cut, so to speak. But in Wraith, the White Wolf World of Darkness game, you are like, there's a sort of a handoff where players are playing each other's shadow selves. And so there's this notion where you could have only one player actively act as the active character in the game, but if you were playing like a 2-player 1 GM sort of a game, the other player is actually manifesting that other character, that character's innermost darkest shadow. And quite a few other games have done that. The game that I mentioned, Chaotic, is an utterly bizarre and insane game. I'm not even sure how somebody comes up with this game, but there's this convoluted backstory involving an alien incursion where humans are sending psychics into another dimension to take control of aliens and sabotage the invasion of Earth. And so these groups of people are taking over one alien body, and you've got a group of like 5 psychics all sitting around while one of them is piloting this alien body and doing the stuff. And all of the background characters are called crickets because they're just sort of chirping in the background while the other character is doing the stuff. And based on whatever your particular expertise is, you sort of take over that body and do the thing that needs to be done at that particular time. But I think there are a lot of games that kind of like work very specifically on coming up with ways to model an inner dialogue or an inner struggle by having the other players participating in that external, in that only as external forces, either giving a player an NPC role to play, or having characters play inner voices or things like what's that, Bluebeard's Ghost, the one where you're literally, one character is navigating Bluebeard's castle, and the other characters are ghosts of his previous wives, all trying to advise and steer the living character. And so like I said, there were, it used to be that you could just say, well, games that have a lot of inner dialogue and inner emotional turmoil are probably not best for RPGs. But now I think somebody will do it, and they'll come up with a cool way to involve more characters. And I mean, the question of like, what is an RPG? Some people say, well, but these games are just pure storytelling. And I'm like, what makes an RPG? Is it an element of chance? By that standard, then chess and checkers are not games because there's no element of chance there. So I guess that's about as profound as I can get on that topic. Again, I feel like I'm just rebutting you. You lay up a ball and I slam it back over the net and go, no, refused.
No, they're good rebuttals. And once again, I think you're right. I think that in terms of the roles that different players bring to a game and the number of players has sort of been broken open. Let me throw another ball at you then.
Sure.
When we talk about a television series, right? We can obviously, people have made every kind of TV series. There's different lengths, but there's still a common understanding around something like the commercial TV half hour, a 23-minute show that's going to be this kind of thing. There are assumptions around a format. And when we talk about the assumptions that are made around what a classic TTRPG is, what are the kind of things that when you hear about them being applied to a TTRPG, you think, that's going to need something clever, or that's going to need to be done in a different or unique way because it is slightly broadening the perspective?
Yeah, I would say that the things that always make I have a vast collection of RPGs, and I pretty much, I will admit that much to the dismay of my shelves, it takes very little for me to jump on, buying a new RPG and exploring and seeing what they bring to the table, what new aspect. But the ones that are always the most intriguing to me are games where there is no fixed narrator or game master. I don't think that it's necessary to use dice or, pixie sticks or Jenga blocks, or any of these are not intrinsically necessary for an RPG to be a game and whatnot. I think that it is the role playing that is important, and the notion of like the unpredictability is other character or other people. That to me is where things become surprising and interesting. But it's games that, like, for example, Fiasco, where it's very intrinsically designed to be this sort of emulating these weird genre fiction things that also sort of break the mold of what genre can be, and they spin out into unpredictable things. So I would say games that don't have a game master to sort of guide them are the ones that I think are the most challenging, because they ultimately depend on all of the players collaborating and buying into the central conceit of that game, which I think is, there are sometimes players who, bless their hearts, as they say, just want to be there and just kind of want to explore things. And maybe they're playing on their phone half the time, or they're just there because, they like the company, and, there's some pizza and food. And they're a valid backbone of the gaming audience, but at the same time, for games that require a lot of this sort of deep storytelling stuff and a lot of quick thinking and improvisation, those are usually the games that I think are a little more challenging. And then on the flip side, I think that there are games where they rely almost exclusively on the GM spinning out this incredible story without the crutches of conflict. And those, I think, also are like, how do you get a GM who can just like barf out all of this narration when there's no clear like set world, where you're just spinning stuff up out of the ether. So those are the ones that I think are the most challenging. And I don't think a lot of games handle that well,
I'd like to hit you with a couple of sort of classic ideas about what might be difficult to do in TTRPGs, or some classic lines about what might be breaking the genre a little bit. And I want to get your gut reaction to them. So feel free to knock these all down too. You ready for a list?
Sure.
All right, let's start off with this. What about TTRPGs where you are basically doomed to lose? The players don't get to win. You have a predetermined outcome, so it's not really a game in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's that game 10 Candles, where are you familiar with it? Yes. It is, you've got a circle of candles, tea lights, and they are going to burn down. There is no, I mean, other than, some weird ever burning candles or somebody switching out little, electric light candles on you. The game will grind to inevitable conclusion, which everyone dies. And there's not even a everyone loses, there's an everyone dies. The world ends, blackness takes over, and it is a very nihilistic game. I think that game is also very effective and very affecting. There are random elements to it. You're rolling dice, you're trying to determine what happens. There are, one might even argue that Call of Cthulhu was the original like nihilistic game, and that if you follow Lovecraft's ideology, you think, oh, ultimately the old ones will rise and will conquer the world, and humanity will be swept away, and it's only a matter of raging against the dying of the light until you can't do it anymore. So I would think that games in which failure and fate are inexorable are actually fine. They can be pretty fun.
What about games that have a very heavy reliance on tech and computerized systems? What if you are not just using a virtual tabletop, but you are getting AI generated prompts, or even, and I have seen posts on TTRPG forums, people playing effectively with the responses that are generated by computers. Is that becoming something else, or is it still a TTRPG?
I think that it's probably entering a new phase. I don't know if I would say it's necessarily becoming something else. It's just another flavor in this gigantic Baskin Robbins of RPGs. But I don't know. I think that you're basically computerized prompts. It's not much different from an actual just drawing cards, and many games have incorporated drama and plot twist cards into their narratives, or just randomized tables. When things get boring, roll a d6 and see what happens. Random encounter tables go all the way back to the very genesis of the hobby, and they can set straightforward adventures off it spiraling into crazy sort of directions based on just the outcome of the single fight. What seems like a pretty straightforward, we go to the dungeon, we go into the dungeon, we fight some things, and come out with treasure, becomes crazier when you have a random encounter before you get to the dungeon that cripples the party or causes all sorts of mayhem and dismay, and suddenly everything has changed. And I mean, I've actually played in games where player characters died before reaching the party because based on a random encounter where we were all camping in the wilderness, and one of the characters decided to come up to our campfire and ran into a savage beast. We heard a scream in the night, and later we found his body. Horrible, horrible stuff. But the computer stuff is cool. I personally, just as a standpoint, I find that my preference is not to have a lot of screens at the table at once, because once people are looking down, they're not looking at each other. Once they've got their devices and they're doing this, and then as a you never know if they're like suddenly looking at their email or checking or chatting with about their dinner plans with for later, and that can be a little distracting. You never know what somebody is paying attention to.
What about when you take board games and you sort of bring a layer of role playing into them? You're playing something like Settlers of Catan or something like that, and you start to add your whole extra layer of lore and kind of role playing into it, even though it's not necessarily there. Is that still role playing in the same traditional sense?
Absolutely. Are you taking on a character? Are you behaving in character? I mean, this goes all the way back to the old TSR, I think it was TSR dungeon board game, where you were like elf, dwarf, knight, wizard, and you were exploring this world. Your characters had, I think you had like 1 or 2 special abilities. It was a very rudimentary game, but and it sort of paved the way for games like Talisman later, which were more complex. But in Talisman, you're playing like, I'm a Black Knight. I have certain abilities. I'm the prophetess. I have magical abilities, and I've seen players get quite into the role playing of those. And so again, and then you've got games like Escape the Dark Castle, which is also in that sort of idiom where you're basically playing medieval peasants and whatnot, trying to escape the Dark Castle, all the way to stuff like Descent and Gloomhaven, which is, I mean, a weird hybrid of board game and RPG, and that it somehow manages to take everything about an RPG and turn it into a board game mechanic, which I find a little disorienting personally.
Here's a different way to approach things. If we accept that we can really do anything as a TTRPG, you can tell any story. You can still have stuff that's really, really hard. If I say to you right now, Jason, we're going to jump into the Great Pendragon campaign, we both know that's a great story and it works, but it's a huge time commitment. This is going to be difficult. What kind of stories are just harder to tell?
I honestly think that given that we are all modern beings living in a world where we are all beset by family, our relationships, our work, our health, our just sheerness of travel and physical locations, I think that the epic campaigns of yore are getting increasingly harder to do. It feels like when we were all younger, maybe, I know that when we all thought, oh, when I get older, I'll have time to really like do the Pendragon campaign or do, the Doomstones or the Enemy Within for Warhammer, or, us at the mount or Beyond the Mountains of Madness for Call of Cthulhu, these epic campaigns. You figured, I'm a grown up, I'll have the ability to just book some time. And it seems to be increasingly hard. And so when you find yourself oftentimes with gaps of like a month between sessions, keeping track of all of this minute stuff, like games that like, for example, Beyond the Mountains of Madness, where you've got a lot of inventory management, you're trying to figure out, like, do we have enough supplies to survive? A lot of that kind of stuff can be a little difficult to track session to session. And so I think a lot of people are also kind of getting more interested in games where they're not coming in as these like low level, hapless, basically just out of their teens, a stubble of beard, and getting trying to work their way up from 0 to first level and all this. I think that because people are more, their time is more meaningful, they want to have games where they are heroic from the get-go.
What about rules? Let's say that we're going to jump into, some hardcore burning wheel using the full combat system, the full social encounter system, or, we're going to go into GURPS with every stat block of, available for use. Is a game that just has a really high barrier to entry because there's so much of it, harder to do?
Again, it's all the chemistry of the game masters and the player group. I know, I have a friend here locally. She's new into tabletop RPGs. She only started after the pandemic began because she had a lot of improv friends, and she thought, she was a big fan of Dragon Age. And then I mentioned, oh, there's the Dragon Age RPG. And she went, oh my God, I must play Dragon Age. And and she found that she was starting to get onto Roll20 and try to get into games of Dragon Age, but there are very few. But then she found D&D and Pathfinder. There were always seats available in games. But she mentioned that she's like, oh my goodness, everyone always wants to do the entire tactical experience, where my friends and I, when we play, we're much more about getting into character and, making skill rolls when they're required, and, these sort of getting out the battle map and figuring out facing and how many hexes of movement everybody is doing and what modifiers apply and what feats stack. Like, that just became burdensome. And so I think, though, that there are other players that is the meat and bones of the game. And if you're not playing that, to them, you're not playing the game at all. And so I think it's just a matter of the the agreement, that the assumption that the game master has with the players, and ideally everyone's on the same page with that.
You've been playing TTRPGs for a long time. You've been creating them for a long time. Is there a story or, a type of story that you have yet to play, not because you've deliberately avoided it, but that you want to? It's just for a combination of reasons never really worked for you, whether that be logistics, time, interest, the right system?
I think it's primarily just a matter of circumstance, but I would really love someday to play a game of just absolute exploration, perhaps whether science fiction-y or science fantasy. The notion of the fish out of water, characters coming into a broad and uncharted space, whether that be a landmass, whether that be astral realms, whether that be like some country that is full of just wild animals and cultures that haven't been encountered yet before, almost the Star Trek narrative. But or rather the original series, only without all of that stuff. But I'd also like to try to figure out how you can do a game like that doesn't descend into colonialism or resource harvesting and whatnot. Like a game of actual exploration and discovery, I think would be a delight. But I don't know that I have the system that would work with that, and I haven't necessarily got an angle that I think would appeal to a player group that I happen to have at any given time. And so again, like I said, I'm a big fan of science fantasy. So in my idea, I would probably love to have characters exploring some fantastic and strange world that some Baroque technology and whatnot, and ancient civilizations long vanished, that kind of a thing.
So for anybody who might have seen the title of this video, who's maybe thinking of creating a TTRPG or running something for their friends, but they're not quite sure if it's going to work, what's your final piece of advice to them?
I would say just absolutely do it. Don't think about what you can and can't do, but just think about what you want to do. one of the legends of the RPG industry, a guy named Eric Wujcik, designer of Amber Diceless Role-Playing, the Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles game. I think he was also heavily involved in early Paranoia and some other great titles. I think Ninjas and Super Spies, that kind of stuff. Eric would tell me that he, for example, when he was designing Amber, he always imagined that dice would get into it somewhere. And so he kept designing and playtesting, and then he figured there would come a certain point where you have to pull out some dice and make a roll to determine, like, does this succeed or fail? And then as he went on, he started to realize, I actually haven't hit that point yet. There's no point where I want to have the outcome of a conflict or a situation resolved randomly. It should all be intrinsic to the characters and the narrative that they're building and what the players are doing. And so, and I like that attitude. And that's actually a philosophy that I try to apply to game design, is you design until you need a rule, you develop. And so if you want to come up with a game about office romances in a Japanese mega corporation, do it, and don't worry about like falling damage rules and social fatigue points or anything like this. I mean, just only hit the wall of I need a rule here when it becomes absolutely necessary. And if you decide that you can start with a sort of tabula rasa, this blank slate, and start creating the story and the narrative you want to try to build, or create the framework that the players can create these narratives in, just don't assume automatically that a rule is going to prevent you from doing something cool and fun with that. And so I would say anybody, design as far as you can before you need to, like bring it in. And ultimately you may find out that you can really design games about anything at all.